Let's take a look at how to adapt every lens ever made to any Nikon Z camera. First, let's cover some of the basics of format. Ideally, use full-frame lenses on full-frame cameras and APS-C lenses on APS-C cameras. You can reverse them. I can take this full-frame Nikon Z lens and this DX Z lens and put them on each of the other kinds of cameras. What we get is we're now wasting over half of the sensor and over half of the pixels of the Z7 or Z6 full-frame cameras when we mount a DX lens on them. So we're throwing away most of what the camera can do and paying 2 or 3 times as much as we could have just shot them on the Nikon Z50. We can use the full-frame lenses in the Z50 and they work just fine, but you're throwing away most of the performance of the lens. For instance, this 24mm f1.8 is a lot bigger than this guy set to 24 millimeters. This offers more speed, but you're throwing away most of the performance and most of the image that you're paying top dollar for when you use a full-frame lens on an APS-C camera. So I don't recommend using a lens from one format on another format camera just because it's less elegant. You may want to use your really long lenses on your APS-C cameras, and that can make some sense. But admittedly, for APS-C cameras, Nikon makes the 50 to 250 millimeter lens, which is extraordinary. So I wouldn't spend too much time trying to adapt. Here now is how to adapt anything and everything to either of these cameras. All the lenses I'm going to talk about are full frame. The Nikon FTZ adapter, which we'll cover in more depth in just a moment, you can use that to adapt APS-C lenses like this wonderful APS-C AFP 18 to 55 millimeter lens. But why would you want to do that? Because you've already got this superb 16 to 50 that you usually get for a bargain on this camera, and it is so much smaller. Let's say goodbye to the APS-C camera and get on to full frame, because all the lenses throughout history, which we're going to cover over 100 years of history here, are full frame lenses. I'm going to go from the brand new lenses off to ancient lenses, which means depending on whatever lens you're trying to adapt, as soon as you see the lens you're trying to adapt, you can sign out. First off, Z lenses. The native Z lenses are recognized, presuming they're actually a Z lens and not a Canon lens, which has a very similar looking mount. The Z lenses simply will say Z and Nikon or Nikkor on them, as well as the fact that these contacts face straight back. That's a Z mount lens. They're native for that. You don't need my video to tell you that. Nikon makes an FTZ adapter, which is a bit of a kludge because it only works with half of the lenses that Nikon has out there. The FTZ adapter works great if you have an AFP lens, which is easily recognized by saying AFP. It also works great with all the AFS lenses, which are also identified by saying AFS. Both the AFS and AFP are recognized also by having a lot of electrical contacts. Those should work great. If you're going to use any of these lenses, which are most of the lenses Nikon's made in the past few years, all you need is the Nikon FTZ adapter, and you're good to go. To get a little bit older, back in year 2000, Nikon made this crazy thing called an AIP. It has electrical contacts, fewer of them, but it's a manual focus lens. With these lenses, which are rare, use again Nikon's FTZ adapter, which will read these contacts and give you full EXIF data and all of the automatic exposure modes in your Nikon Z cameras. And that should work quite well. That's where the fun stops, and that's why this video is here. Even older than AIP are autofocus lenses. Now here's where the problem starts. This is a 1980s style autofocus lens. The original autofocus lenses from Nikon focused mechanically. They did not have a motor in the lens like everything from Canon and Fuji and the newer Nikon AFP, AFI, and AFS lenses have. These original autofocus lenses, and the sad part is Nikon still sells and manufactures these to this day. They have a little screw terminal there. There's a little screwdriver that pokes out of the single lens reflex cameras that operate these lenses and make them focus. If you use one of these on an FTZ, you just lost autofocus. That's a severe defect in the design of the FTZ. They chose not to put in the motor that would let these lenses autofocus. What is good about using this lens on the FTZ is it will read these electrical contacts, and you will have full EXIF data and exposure information and exposure control, and all of the automatic exposure modes will work just great with any of these autofocus lenses. The first of these came out in 1986. They were simply called Autofocus, or AF, and they will say AF Nikkor on them. In 1993, Nikon introduced the concept of distance coupling, which is the D after the aperture. This is an AF-D lens. The only purpose of the D function is that it couples the focused distance into the camera's light meter to help with flash exposure. The sad part is there's no adapter made yet today which has an autofocus motor to drive these lenses. And there are probably more of these lenses out there used than any of the modern lenses. Going even older, we have manual focus lenses, which are the finest mechanical lenses Nikon has ever made. Optically, they can range from superb to not as good as the native Z lenses. You'll recognize these lenses. They'll have an aperture ring, but they'll have no electronic contacts is the easiest way to recognize them. Plus, they'll be made out of metal and be built nicer than anything Nikon's done in quite some time. For these lenses lacking any electronic contacts, you don't need to buy the FTZ. You could buy one of these little adapters from China directly off of eBay, and I have a link in my description to do that. And for maybe $10 or $15, they work exactly as well as the FTZ. Because there's no data to communicate, there's no need to pay extra for the FTZ. Neither of these adapters couple or read the set aperture on the lens. You have to set the aperture manually for everything you do and focus manually. But you certainly can take pictures and you will get some kinds of metering. A problem is that as you stop these lenses down, and this goes for every older lens I'm going to mention here today, because the camera really has no idea what the actual set aperture on the lens is, it thinks it's dark outside and makes your finder image darker as well. There are some crazy manual focus lenses. This opens up the entire field of Nikon's manual focus lenses that they have made for single lens reflexes back since 1959. This nutty thing is a fisheye lens, and it works just fine. It works even better than it ever did on single lens reflexes because we can mount this and it goes into the camera, but there's no mirror. That's why they call it mirrorless. This works just great on this adapter. And that's the way to use it. Any cheap $10 adapter from China is all you need to use any of these ancient lenses. If you try to use a non-AI lens, which is a lens that does not have this lip cut into, it would have only one line of apertures, not two. Those lenses are very old, and those lenses may or may not properly mount on any of these adapters. What will happen is there may be some interference between their ring going backwards here and interfering with the diameter of this flange on the mount. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Nikon never recommends you do that, but to be honest, it works just fine if you can get a lens and adapter that work well together. Let's go even further back. Again, my Nikon lens history video is up as well, which explains the lenses in more detail. From the 1940s through 1960s, this is what a Nikon was. This was the Nikon Rangefinder camera that came out just after World War II and uses a contacts mount. This is a completely incompatible mount with any Nikon single lens reflex camera ever made. However, now with the Z cameras, for the first time ever since 1959, use these on our Nikon full frame cameras. This is what the lens mount looks like. It looks the same as the contacts mount because it is a copy of the contacts mount. How do we adapt these? This is a little tougher. What you have to do is find a Nikon S. It's called the Nikon S mount or contacts rangefinder mount to Leica adapter. And that's what I recommend if you're going to start playing around with lots of lens adapters, is you get an adapter that adapts to the Leica mount. This is an adapter, and these are expensive because it has a focusing helicoid in it because those cameras, these rangefinder cameras, had a focusing helicoid built in for their lenses. This adapter includes the focus helicoid, which is required to use these lenses because these lenses are just a barrel. There we go. Now it adapts to Leica. I don't know that you can find one ever that would adapt straight to Nikon, but here's the trick. You go out and get one of these $10 Leica M to Nikon Z adapters, and now you can adapt every Leica lens as well as every one of these lenses which you've adapted to Leica. So if you want to shoot a practical lens or any lens you could imagine, get an adapter to adapt to Leica, and then you can go from Leica to any other brand you want because Leica lenses are so prevalent. And that way you only have to buy one set of adapters to go from any camera to any other camera. In other words, if you shoot Nikon and Canon, get a Leica M to Nikon Z. I also have a Leica M to Canon EOS R. And then I only need this 1-2 Leica adapter. I don't know if you can see how that goes, but as you have more brands, by unifying them to go from one universal brand, say Leica, to everything else, you don't have to buy a Nikon S to Nikon Z adapter, which probably doesn't even exist. You mount this on here, and you are good to go. Nikon makes two kinds of mounts for these rangefinders. There's the small mount, which is this little guy here. I'm going to put this back on my Nikon camera, like so. They also make external mounts. This is an external bayonet mount. It also mounts in the same camera. You'll notice this old camera has an external bayonet on the outside. Well, these also mount on this little adapter here. The 35mm f1.8 lens is the world's first ultra-speed wide-angle, and it works pretty well in the Z cameras. And that's the adapter you need if you can find a Nikon S to Leica adapter. Of course, once you have this $10 adapter, you can shoot all the Leica lenses. Leica's first 50mm f1.4 works great. This lens is from 1960s. If you want to shoot, say, the modern state-of-the-art Leica lenses, here's a Leica M, a spherical 35mm f1.4. Mounts like a champ. If you want to use Leica lenses with goggles, lenses like this 135mm as well as a 35mm have goggles that optimize the rangefinder of the Leica M3. That can make things a bit confusing. Can you mount this on here with this adapter? No, you can't mount it because there's interference. The trick is, and this is why you're watching this video, if you mount the lens to the adapter first, now, the way the rotations work is you can mount this whole assembly to the camera. Bingo. There you go. Works like a champ. Leica made 35mm lenses as well as 135mm lenses with these adaptive optics. And you know, they work just great. Another trick. Again, you can't get the lens off the adapter either this way. That could confuse your friends. People won't be stealing your Leica lenses. You have to take the adapter off first, then take the adapter off the lens. What about screw mount? The original 35mm lenses. Easy. You go out and get a bunch of these. This is called a Leica screw mount to Leica M adapter. You get this and screw it on the back of your Leica screw mount lens, and then you can mount that to your Leica M adapter, thusly. And here you go. And then you can mount your screw mount lens on this. And oh, let's see if it'll collapse if I'm going to break anything. Let's do this live on TV here. No, it collapses just fine. Again, the mirrorless cameras have such little in them that these will collapse just fine. And here's your 50mm f2 Sumatar that works just great. But the real question is how to adapt Canon lenses to Nikon Z. Well, the hard way is, as I said, you can easily get an EOS to Leica M adapter. And then you can take your Leica M to Nikon Z adapter, and you can mount this contraption to your Nikon Z. The problem is that there's no diaphragm control of the Canon lenses. They're controlled electronically. You can focus, but you'd always be shooting wide open. But there's a better solution. A Chinese company called Fringer, it makes an awesome little adapter which has electronic contacts and firmware that couple autofocus and the aperture and everything from the Canon lens to the Nikon Z system. So you simply use this adapter, which works also with the Canon EFS lenses. Couple that to your Nikon Z. Bingo. You now get everything Canon made within limits. There's a couple of lenses that won't work with this adapter, although as time goes on, more things will be covered. My 50mm f1.0 and my 300mm f2.8 from 1987 use a very different motor system that doesn't work with this adapter. But everything else I've tried, my old lenses, my 14mm f2.8 original one, everything else works just fine with this adapter. And you get full autofocus, you get fast autofocus, autofocus tracking, vibration reduction, full exposure modes, full exposure control, and that is a great way to adapt your Canon family of lenses onto the Nikon Z cameras. Although, to be honest, I think it makes a lot more sense to just buy the EOS R if you want to use your Canon lenses, because their ring adapter costs less than this particular adapter, and on top of that is a 100% compatible, and I happen to prefer the Canon EOS full-frame cameras. But that's a different story. And that's how to adapt any kind of lens ever made to the Nikon Z series of cameras. Thanks for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com, and kenrockwell.tv.